Hello, everybody in the room and everybody in Zoom land. We're about to begin. My name is Cynthia Cook, and I'm the president of the Clinton Historical Society. And this is a red letter day for us because you have all just entered the fully ADA accessible Creek Meeting House. You walked up our new slate walk, and then you just walked right in here. There's no threshold. So if you're on a wheelchair or a walker, you can, and if you should use the restroom, we have now one fully accessible restroom, push bars if we have an emergency. So thank you for joining us this historic evening at the Historic Creek Meeting House. And I want to thank a few people who have been responsible for tonight's program. Of course, in addition to our speaker, Stacy Whittaker, whom you'll hear from very shortly. First of all, Elliot Werner, who lines up programs for us and deals with our speakers beforehand. I want to thank him. And Bob Schock, who is our new IT technology guy, who set up the work with the hybrid system so we can be here and on Zoom at the same time. Kathy McMahon, who is on the Zoom and her home monitoring things on that end. So this is extremely complex for a little group like us. And Kathy also does the publicity and handles sending things out on the website. So she's a very important person. And Marge Fountain and Julie have brought us some refreshments for after the program. And I want to put out a little advertisement for our next program, which will be Friday, June 7th, 7:30. It'll be Richard Leahy, Carriages and Sleighs of the Hudson Valley. It'll again be here as well as available on Zoom for those of you who want to join us that way. Next Friday and Saturday is the upcoming tag sale. You can see the things are accumulating, and we're happy if you have things out there or here in the room, please just leave them on the front porch, and the committee will take care of that. And that will be again on May 10th and 11th, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And then I want to put in a big plug for the resurrection of the driving tour. We did a driving tour before COVID, and we have now gotten reorganized, and it will be on June 15th. It will run from 11 to 6. The tour itself, which is a driving tour in the sense that people drive and visit 12 different historic landmarks in the town of Clinton. We have researched the houses. They are houses that are part of our Historic Landmarks program, and there will be docents at each of the places to talk about the architecture of the house as well as the history from what we know of the people who lived there. It's a major fundraiser. The day concludes with a lovely reception on Allen Road at the home of Chip Holman and Merida Wells, and it will definitely be a lovely, lovely event. Watch, if you're members, we'll be sending out a save the date, and it's also coming in the newsletter. And again, as I said, it's a fundraiser, so we hope that you will be generous and join us because it benefits the continuing restoration of this building. And as I know, you're all waiting anxiously to hear from Stacy Whittaker, and you know she will be speaking about embroidered samplers from Dutchess County and how much they can tell us about local history, women's education, religion, material culture, and more. She will give special attention to work made by girls from Clinton and the nearby towns, and will discuss the Dutchess County Sampler Initiative and why our area is so important in the history of American schoolgirl needlework. Stacy Collins Whittaker is a lifelong local resident. Her family's roots go back several generations. I keep looking at her for those of you who are on Zoom because she's standing right next to me. She has been interested in both textiles and local history from a young age, and after receiving a degree in art from Skidmore College, returned home and continuing studying both. She continued her educational experience on samplers and textiles by attending conferences and symposia at such institutions as Winterthur, the Peabody Essex Museum, Williamsburg, and more. She's also became keenly interested in the tradition of female education in Dutchess County. As an embroiderer herself, samplers and schoolgirl needlework have always held particular appeal for her. In the early 2000s, she had the opportunity to work with the sampler collection at Vassar College, along with Joanne Lukacher. She and Joanne became the project leads for the Dutchess County Sampler Initiative, which she will be speaking about tonight. And so, without further delay, welcome, Stacy, and I'm so delighted that you can be with us this evening.
Hey, thank you, everybody. We'll have to muddle along here with our slides as best we can, but I think we have acceptable show for you. As you were just told, my name is Stacy Whittaker, and I'm here today to tell you a bit about the tradition of samplers and schoolgirl needlework in Dutchess County. First, I will be giving an overview of the Dutchess County Sampler Initiative and the Sampler Archive. Then, using many examples of embroideries made right here in our county and some made right here in the town of Clinton, I will attempt to show the varied types of needlework that were made by girls at school and how those pieces relate to the broader history of women's education. And finally, I will be telling you some sampler stories that relate specifically to Clinton and the surrounding area. On display are several local samplers, as well as some other materials described in the program, and I invite you to come up and look at them after the talk. Before I begin, I would like to thank the sponsoring partners of the Sampler Initiative, the Dutchess County Historical Society, the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center at Vassar College, the Sampler Consortium, and the Sampler Archive. I would also like to thank Mike Frazier and the Rhinebeck Historical Society, the staff of the Star Library, site of our first Sampler ID Day in June of 2023, and Cliff Lab and his staff at the Wallace Center at the FDR Historic Site, who hosted our second ID Day event in September. And special thanks is due to Craig Marshall and the Clinton Historical Society. Craig has understood and supported our project from the beginning and done a great deal to help us. A big thank you is also due to the numerous volunteers and donors who have helped make the project a reality. I would also like to thank Mr. Bill Coster, a CHS member, who graciously allowed much of his important sampler collection to be documented. And of course, thanks to Cynthia Cook and Elliot Warner and everyone at CHS for having me here tonight. Let's see. Advance. There we go. Oh, I finally get to meet you. That's exciting. I've heard a lot about you. Okay. As some of you may know, my colleague Joanne Lukacher and I are co-leads of the Dutchess County Sampler Initiative, and we are both independent sampler scholars and researchers. We first teamed up in the early 2000s when we began working extensively with the remarkable collection of over 300 samplers at the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center at Vassar College. We collaborated on Vassar's 2004 exhibit and accompanying three-day sampler symposium entitled Thanks Be to My Friends. In conjunction with that exhibit, I published several reproduction sampler patterns from that collection, which we used as a fundraising source for some much-needed conservation of some of the Vassar samplers. My personal interest in historic textiles has been lifelong, and for more than 30 years, my studies have concentrated on American samplers. Due to my deep family roots in Dutchess County stretching back to the 18th century, I have special interest in local needlework and our tradition of women's education. Also inspired by one of the samplers in that exhibit, Joanne developed an interest in samplers from Norfolk, England. After a number of years of study, she went on to author Imitation and Improvement, the Norfolk Sampler Tradition, a book published in 2013 that has become world-renowned as the definitive reference study of Norfolk samplers. It's on the back table there. Joanne and I have both continued to research, study, and write about samplers, and for some time we've been working on locating and identifying samplers here in Dutchess County. Examples of some of our work are on display here today. Well, maybe this will work. Right on back here. It moved before.
Technical help is needed. We don't know how to advance a slide.
It worked last time.
Are you using the page up and down keys, Stacy?
Yes, I am.
And it's not moving.
It is not moving.
Do you know how to get that window back that was on the left with the little slides?
No. Oh, goodness gracious. There we go. We got one. Okay. I hope this isn't going to continue all night. Now back to the Dutchess County Sampler Initiative, an exciting project, the purpose of which is to locate, photograph, and document all American samplers and schoolgirl embroideries held in both public and private collections in Dutchess County. The photographs and documentation that we collect become part of the sampler archive. As a point of clarification, although most of our personal research is concentrated on local samplers, at the initiative events, we are looking to document all American pieces that are now located here in the county, not just those originally made here. There we go. The Sampler Archive is a freely available online database containing high-resolution images and documentary information about American samplers and schoolgirl embroideries from the 17th through the 19th centuries. The archive, which is a project sponsored by the Sampler Consortium, has been in development for many years and is directed by Dr. Lynn Anderson, Professor Emeritus at the University of Oregon. The long-range goal of this project is to document all American samplers and schoolgirl embroideries held in both public and private hands. Although this is a gargantuan task, great strides have been made, and there are already thousands of samplers in the database. Joanne and I have been involved in this project for a number of years and have participated in the addition of both the Glee-Kruger collection and the Vassar collection. I will show you the archive site and how it works a little later in the talk. Gathering information and images to include in the archive is accomplished in a few different ways. Institutions such as museums and large historical societies who already have acceptable high-resolution images of their sampler collections can transfer those images to the archive, and then trained documenters can input the remaining information online. This has been done by Whittaker, the DAR Museum, the Rhode Island Historical Society, the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center, and many others. In some cases, private collectors with extensive collections can also arrange to have an on-site documentation. But the third and most exciting way that samplers are documented is through the Sampler ID Days. At these events, individuals, collectors, local historical societies, and small museums can bring their pieces to a location where we have a professional object photographer and trained volunteers available to document each piece. Many of these events have taken place in Delaware, Rhode Island, and Vermont. Joanne and I were able to participate in one of the Vermont ID Days, and that gave us valuable experience, which helped us conduct our first two events. Our first Dutchess County ID Day, which was in June of 2023 at the Star Library, and the second was at the Wallace Center at FDR Historic Site in Hyde Park. Between those two events, we were able to document 132 samplers and schoolgirl embroideries, more than half of which were made in Dutchess County. Both during and after those two events, we were able to identify many other sources of local samplers, and we will continue to hold ID events as we can secure venues and funding. Sampler ID Days work like this. Typically, they are scheduled for 2 days, a Friday and a Saturday. Part of each day is reserved for appointments, and the rest of the day we accept walk-ins. We ask those who are bringing 3 or more pieces to schedule appointments so that the long wait times are avoided. After arrival, each sampler travels to 4 stations: registration, documentation, photography, and family history. And here you see a contributor having her sampler registered, which is the first step of the 4-step process. This is our highly skilled photographer, Thomas Clark of Bennington, Vermont, hard at work. Thomas photographs the framed samplers without removing them from their frames, and he also records images of the back of pieces that contain any pertinent information or labeling. No samplers or needleworks are disturbed in any way by our documentation process. For unframed pieces, we carefully place them on fabric or tissue-covered acid-free boards, and images of both back and front of the samplers are recorded. Thomas then sends his photographs on to our image manager in Oregon, who works his electronic magic to get the images into the archive database. Sometime after the event, participants receive a copy of the digital photograph of each of their samplers at no charge. The next step is documentation, and these photos show two of our volunteer teams entering information. It is a daunting task to record measurements, stitch types, fabric count, thread types, and colors, and to transcribe all text. But the teams soon develop a rhythm and the process moves along. The process for documentation was years in the making to assure that everyone uses the same terminology and methods. Due to the standardization of training and methodology, the archive database can be searched successfully. Volunteer documenters attend online training and submit practice documentation for review ahead of time to assure that they're proficient. Studying the samplers so closely often brings fascinating details to light. Volunteers can attest to how interesting it is to view these pieces up close and compare them. After doing a few pieces, documenters begin to develop an eye for details that may have been previously overlooked. And here you see two of our family history documenters, Bonnie Wood and Mike Frazier, both talented local historians. They're recording information about the provenance of the pieces and the information about the sampler makers. Sometimes that information provided by the owner can be scanty, as in, I bought it at an antique store and I don't know anything about it. Other times, owners come armed with files of genealogical information and family history, which they are anxious to share. Shown here on the left are Mr. and Mrs. David Greenwood, who have an extensive collection of 9 partner school samplers, and on the right is Ken Snodgrass, Executive Director of Locust Grove, and his assistant, documenting some of the embroideries from that collection. Sampler owners often learn a great deal about their own samplers by talking with sampler experts, documenters, and others on site. In Vermont, Joanne and I were able to decipher the birth and maker's first name on a sampler, information that was previously unknown to the owner. At one of our Dutchess events, embroideries made by two Stanfordville sisters were brought in by 2 different owners. One of whom is here tonight. Neither knew of the existence of the other previously. Here you see those 2 pieces made by Melissa and Emily Fredenberg. The eagle-eyed among you will notice that the surname is spelled differently in these 2 pieces, but they were indeed sisters. Phonetic and sometimes arbitrary spelling is one of the challenges of sampler research. At each of our sites, ID days have been a great success. Often sampler owners have gone home with a much deeper appreciation and understanding of their pieces and an enthusiasm to learn more. A little later in the talk, I will show you how the Sampler Archive site works and how anyone can access the information that is being gathered. You may have noticed that other sampler initiatives were statewide, such as Delaware, Rhode Island, and Vermont. You may be wondering why we chose to focus on Dutchess County rather than New York or even the Mid-Hudson Valley. The answer is that we are fortunate to live in an area where women's education flourished in the period of sampler making. Beginning in the late 1700s and continuing for the next 100 years, this area abounded with female academies, seminaries, boarding schools, and Quaker schools. Here you see just a few examples of advertisements for schools in the Poughkeepsie area, including Cottage Hill, run by Matthew Vassar's niece, Lydia Booth, who reputedly encouraged him to begin his plans for a women's college. But female academies and seminaries and small day and boarding schools were found all over Dutchess County, not just in Poughkeepsie. Only a few other places in the country can boast such a rich tradition of female education and schoolgirl embroidery. Now I would like to describe the types of samplers and schoolgirl embroideries that we document. As you will see, most of the examples that I will be showing you today were made right here in Dutchess County. First, though, it is important to note that all types of needlework we will be discussing were intended for reference or display and were not utilitarian sewing. And now I see that on my slide, the highlighter has gone across the writing instead of highlighted. That's unfortunate. It doesn't do that on my slides, but it shows up on here. This is an important distinction. In the school setting, embroidery or ornamental needlework would have been a separate class, quite different from the elements of clothing construction and mending, which is referred to as plain sewing. Here we see advertisements for 2 local schools, the MENA Sketchley Boarding School and the Pleasant Valley Boarding School from 1800 and 1803, respectively. Note that in these advertisements, embroidery is clearly differentiated from plain sewing. Of course, you can't see that because it's covered up. Please. We will see examples of work from both these schools later in the talk, and when we do, I think you will agree that the work does not relate to what we would call sewing. The purpose of instructions in ornamental needlework was very different from that of plain sewing. It was not intended as preparation for housekeeping or for possible employment as a seamstress, although it could be useful should the girl go on to be a teacher or even preceptress of a young ladies' academy. Many of the most famous teachers in the late 18th and early 19th century academies were adept needleworkers and had their schoolgirl embroideries to prove it. But even though these women used the embroidery skills taught to them as students to aid in their later careers, it was unlikely that for most, their original course of study was done with that in mind. Although advanced embroidery was generally not part of, you don't need to go ahead, was not part of the standard curriculum, it was offered as an additional course for an extra charge, along with other elective subjects such as music or drawing. A completed and finely stitched ornamental piece stood as proof that the girl attended a respected school, that her family could afford to supplement her studies in this way, and that they were concerned with providing her the finest and most comprehensive education. There were many other benefits to the instruction in sampler making as well. Patience, diligence, time management, development of fine motor skills, artistic composition, and even mathematics could enter into the making of a sampler. Religious or moral verses included often echoed the lessons teachers sought to affirm. It is interesting to note that many so-called progressive schools that we see today, such as Waldorf and Montessori, have rediscovered this method of hands-on education. And in the newly published catalog of the sampler exhibit now on display at the Litchfield Historical Society.
Stacy?
Yes.
It's Kathy. Could you slow down? People are saying they can't follow because you're going too fast.
I'm sorry. I'll be happy to.
And your face is off the screen.
Oh,
Sorry.
sorry.
Thank you.
The voice from above. In the newly published catalog of the sampler exhibit now on display at the Litchfield Historical Society, collector Alexandra Peters, whose samplers make up the exhibit, touches on the idea that the repetitive process of embroidery can lead to a state of focused meditation that is conducive to both relaxation and deep thought. And here I will add an aside about some of the common misconceptions about samplers. There are many frequently repeated inaccuracies about samplers, schoolgirl needlework, and female education in the 18th and 19th century America. First and foremost, time and place are critical for context. It is impossible to make sweeping generalizations about schoolgirl needlework. For example, the educational experience of a Protestant colonist daughter in mid-1660s coastal New England, a wealthy Philadelphia Quaker girl of 1787, you see those two here, a Presbyterian girl in prosperous 1820s northeastern Maryland, and a Dutch reformer's daughter in early 1800s New York were vastly different. Although the resulting needleworks may look similar, the lives of these girls and their family backgrounds and the circumstances of their educations were not the same. Again, this. Why should that do this here, not on my slides? Secondly, an oft-repeated myth is that females in early America were not educated, or if they were sent to school, it was to make them more marriageable. Certainly, in any given time or place, there were uneducated girls and women, but a cursory look through the advertisements for female academies will reveal curriculums that would challenge some college students of today. As we see in these two advertisements for Poughkeepsie female schools of the early to mid-19th century, the course offerings were impressive. Included were ancient history, geology, natural theology, rhetoric, algebra, geometry, philosophy, trigonometry, elements of criticism, chemistry, logic, political economy, astronomy, mineralogy, ancient cartography, and more. And bear in mind that the age of girls attending would have generally been mid to late teens at the oldest. Although having a good education could arguably make a woman a better mate, as we see in the concept of Republican motherhood in the post-revolutionary period, this had more to do with educating the children and guiding the family in political awareness and moral ethics than anything related to cooking and cleaning. I believe the problem stems from the fact that we have confused our own concept of 20th century finishing schools with the 18th and 19th century female academy tradition that produced samplers. In the mid to late 1800s, public education expanded throughout the country. As that happened, free public schooling became more available, female academies and boarding schools, once the only place for a girl to receive a comprehensive academic education, now competed for a lessening number of potential students. Moving into the 20th century, some of those private institutions survived by developing into the exclusive upper-class boarding schools that are more familiar to us. At the same time, some Victorian and Gilded Age society families had become less concerned with their daughters' academic achievements and more with social skills and advantageous connections. However, we must remember that these changes in attitudes happened long after the time that schoolgirl needlework that we study was produced. The concept of female education as a path to marriage seems to have begun and been perpetuated by men, often in a pejorative sense. And even persisting into the 1970s, when I was in college, there were some men who derided all co-eds as pursuing their MRS degree. It wasn't true then, and it wasn't true 150 years before. And here I'll add an aside about a conversation with a friend that I had a few days ago. When she was working her way through a Jesuit college in the 1960s, a priest remarked that she was just attending college to find a husband. Her Irish sense of humor intact, she replied, "Father, there are much easier and less expensive ways to get a husband." And as can be seen, and you'll again have to believe me that it's as it can be seen in the way they were advertised, early to mid 19th century female academies and seminaries were most focused on academic achievement, and the inclusion of music or ornamental arts in the curriculum in no way detracted from that focus. In fact, some of the most exceptional schoolgirl needlework produced in this period was made at the most academically advanced schools. For example, at Sarah Pierce's Litchfield Academy, a school well known for its students' scholastic achievements, many girls also produced exquisite embroidery. Here you see some of the breathtaking embroidery produced by the Bevere sisters at Litchfield, and now in the collection of Locust Grove. As for the number of girls who were educated, the facts may be surprising. Historian Lynn Templeton Brickley states in her paper, "Female Academies Are Everywhere Establishing the Beginnings of Secondary Education for Women in the United States, 1790 to 1830, that the proportion of young women attending academies during the period 1790 to 1830 actually exceeded that of men attending academies and colleges." As we can see by the number of female academies advertised in newspapers at the time, schooling for daughters was not a rarity. And although there are many more misconceptions about this subject, I will touch on one more, that only wealthy and socially prominent girls attended schools where samplers were made. Again, time and place provide needed context. While it is obvious that some of the most spectacular and consequently most often preserved work was made in the elite schools of the late 18th century urban areas such as Philadelphia and Boston, this was due to other factors other than just the wealth of the students. And although there were some schools that were favored by the daughters of the socially prominent, such as the Sketchley School that we will talk about later, moving into the early 19th century, female academies began to draw students from a much wider cross-section of backgrounds. Researching individual sampler makers often reveals girls who came from quite modest means. A fascinating book that illustrates this point is titled "Heading South to Teach: The World of Susan Nye Hutchison, 1850 to 1845 by Kim Tolley." Susan Nye, daughter of an Amenia farm family, almost certainly attended Sarah Pierce's prestigious Litchfield Academy, as did her sister. The Nye family, parents and 8 children, were hardworking and successful farmers, but they were certainly not wealthy, and in fact, by the 1830s, they were heavily in debt, and Susan was helping to support them. As with many aspects of history of both samplers and female education, the story is much more complex and is poorly served by generalizations. Now on to the samplers. The next part of the program will discuss the types of samplers and schoolgirl embroideries that the Sampler Initiative seeks to document. While many samplers include alphabets, a survey of schoolgirl embroidery is not as simple as ABC. Shown in the next slides are some of the different styles of samplers and schoolgirl needlework. Although there are some exceptions, most of the work that is defined as schoolgirl embroidery is that made by a girl between about age 4 and late teens, under the direction of a family member or teacher, typically in a school setting. Here you see two marking samplers. The one on the left was made by Phoebe Smith, daughter of famed Dutchess County Revolutionary War patriot, Dutchess County Sheriff, and member of the Continental Congress, Acton Smith. On the right is an exceptionally well-done piece by 6-year-old Mary King. Mary with the Reverend Sumner Mandeville, pastor of the Freedom Plains Presbyterian Church, and she's buried in the church cemetery. Often, but not always, marking samplers were the first pieces completed by a very young child. And I say child rather than girl because there are many extant samplers, especially marking style samplers made by boys. This may be because some of these pieces were made in so-called dame schools, a version of what we might call a nursery school, a neighborhood school for young children, commonly run by a mature woman, where basic subjects and skills were taught to young children of both sexes. There is speculation that the purpose of such samplers was to learn how to embroider letters for the purpose of marking linens, hence the descriptive term. Linens, being a valuable household commodity, were marked both to identify ownership and to aid in rotation of use. There are also theories that marking samplers help children learn reading and writing, or that they helped as an alphabet reference. Common sense leads us to believe that a certain number of these pieces resulted from an attempt by a mother or teacher to keep active children occupied in a quiet pursuit. And in some cases, what we now refer to as a marking sampler may simply have been a beginner piece in preparation for more elaborate or advanced embroidery. Depending on the circumstances under which one of these samplers was made, any or all of these purposes could have applied. Next is the band style sampler. The one you see here on the left was made by Laura Standish, daughter of Captain Miles Standish of Mayflower fame, thought to be the oldest extant sampler made in America. It now resides in Pilgrim Hall in Plymouth, and after studying it carefully, I can tell you that it's an extraordinarily complex piece of needlework, only a bit over 7 inches in width and stitched so as to be reversible. Band samplers were the prevailing style of sampler in the 16th and 17th century England, so it's not surprising that the earliest American pieces follow this form. Although a plethora of band samplers can be found in England with many stunning pieces in both museum and private collections, American examples, especially early ones, are quite rare. Shown on the right is one featuring white work embroidery bands, a feature often seen on the earliest examples. Although parts of Dutchess County were settled in the 17th century, we have yet to discover any samplers of that age made here. And local samplers prior to 1800 are rare, but they do exist. Shown here is Anna Van Wyck's sampler from my collection, and it's on display here tonight. We have not proved that she is from the Dutchess Van Wyck family, but it's very possible. Shown here is probably the most familiar type of piece, the pictorial sampler. This description covers a wealth of designs from samplers with a few motifs added to some alphabets or a verse to very elaborate designs with landscapes, figures, animals, and buildings. Sometimes the buildings will be identified on the sampler, and sometimes they will be identifiable by sight. Shown here is the Elmira Carmichael sampler from Sand Lake, New York. When researching this sampler in preparation for making the reproduction chart on display here tonight, Pat Moore, Lee Kruger, and I were able to meet with the Sand Lake historian and see Elmira's still standing family home. It bears a remarkable likeness to the house on the sampler, including the porch. My stitched reproduction of this piece is on display here today. Groups of pictorial samplers from a particular school or teacher often feature a specific building, such as these Rhode Island pieces from the Mary Balfe School, which have a depiction of the First Baptist Meeting House in Providence. Whoops. Here we see two nearly identical pictorial samplers, both naming Poughkeepsie, stitched in 1836. They each contain a depiction of a specific building, but is it a real one? I have a theory. Here you see one of Benson Lossing's drawings of the Baltus Barrett Van Cleek House in Poughkeepsie, made a few weeks before it was demolished in 1835. The house, built in 1702, was the first stone structure completed in Poughkeepsie. It was located on Mill Street near Vassar Street and had a storied history, including serving as both the site of several important Revolutionary War meetings and later as the prison of Shaker activist Mother Ann Layton. And here are a few more versions, either by Lossing or taken from his images. Note the fences, the difference in roof height between the main house and the L to the left, and the depiction of the stone facade, which appears brick-like in the prints. While the house in the samplers is not an exact replication of any of these images, I've always wondered if it is not a simplified version depicted in a somewhat flattened perspective. Perhaps it is a coincidence, but the date of the samplers is very close to the date of the demolition, an event which garnered some publicity at the time. The site of the Van Cleek House also may or may not be a coincidence, as several female academies were located nearby. As yet, we do not know in which school these samplers were produced, but the search continues. Here is a close-up view of the house on Hannah Jane Martin's sampler. Is it the Van Cleek House? Maybe, maybe not. Without any primary source evidence, we cannot know, but this is an example of how the study of samplers, even when it leads to no provable conclusion, still brings fascinating insight into history. So after that side journey, let's go back to the styles of samplers we see in documentation. This has a mind of its own. Okay. Some pictorial samplers do not depict a scene or building, but rather just a collection of decorative motifs. Here on the left is a photograph of a sampler made by Catherine Ann Frost in 1850, naming the town of Clinton. Unfortunately, the listing accompanying this photo in the Rhinebeck History Database does not include the source of either the photo or any information on the whereabouts of the sampler itself. As of yet, we have not been able to discover that information. However, as you can see from the other samplers in this slide, Elma Dean of Hyde Park and Catherine Briggs of LaGrange made very similar samplers with this very distinctive border. This sampler design was apparently being taught somewhere nearby for at least 15 years, and there are clues to a strong Quaker connection. It is yet another sampler mystery to be solved. Next are examples of extract or verse samplers commonly done in Quaker schools. These pieces are comprised mainly of a verse, usually of a religious or morally prescriptive nature. The one on the left, made by Eliza Doty, is from Dutchess County, undoubtedly made at a Quaker school, although as yet we cannot positively identify which school. However, the resemblance to the Mary B. Jones sampler on the right, which includes the name of the Nine-Partners School, is a strong clue. Until a record of Eliza's attendance can be found, we can't be 100% certain. Considering that this sampler was very likely made at Nine Partners and the Doty family was scattered throughout Clinton at that time, I suspect that she was indeed a Clinton girl. And where these blue lines came from, I have no idea. I think this is haunted. Eliza's sampler is here today, and I have recently acquired another Doty sampler, likely made by a relative, that you will see here tonight. More on that later. Although these samplers are not especially decorative, the fine ground fabric and possibly tiny stitches serve as testament to a young girl's dedication to her work. The necessary hours and concentration needed to complete such a piece may have instilled values of patience and perseverance, along with the moral of the verse. A memorial or mourning sampler is next, this one from the county as well. It is dedicated to the memory of John M. Thompson, Esquire, who died in 1813, and his son Amos, who died in 1811. It is speculated that John's daughter Clorinda stitched the piece, and that it may loosely represent the Thompson family burying ground in Amelia, although the stitched landscape bears little resemblance to the Smithfield Valley. These pieces often contain many symbolic references, classic or biblical. Although they may seem overly dramatic or contrived to us, the girls who made them and the people who viewed them would have been very familiar with the symbols and able to, in effect, read the messages contained therein. Shown next are examples of family record samplers. The form on the left, to date, to my knowledge, has not been seen in Dutchess County, but it is much more common in the New England states. The tradition of family records, painted in watercolor by a professional artist, spread throughout Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Maine in the late 18th century. And as Peter Bennis shows in his posthumously published book titled Fruits of the Tree of Life, New Discoveries, many of those watercolor designs were later interpreted in embroidery. Samplers that record birth and death dates of family members made in our area are more likely to be in the form of text, as we see here on the right in the Mary E. Atkinson sampler, made by Matthew Vassar's niece in 1832. There is more to the tradition of schoolgirl embroidery than just the typical sampler forms. Some of the most beautiful examples of schoolgirl needlework are silk embroidered pictures and mourning embroideries, and some of the most stunning pieces were made at the MEA Sketchley School in Poughkeepsie. The Sketchley sisters, Mary Elizabeth and Anne, were part of an English family of teachers, which included their father, mother, brother, and sister. Their saga is a long and strange one, and I have been researching it for years. James D. Sketchley, their brother, conducted a school for boys, first in Lansingburg, New York, near Troy, where the sisters also had a young ladies' academy, and then in Poughkeepsie. James, however, was unexpectedly fired from this position in 1800 under scandalous but unexplained circumstances, and he died, as in the Poughkeepsie paper reported soon after, of a broken heart. The Dutchess County Historical Society yearbook of 1954 has an interesting story about his death written by Amy Vernoy, but there are more questions yet to be answered. The embroidery shown here is by Elizabeth Smith and is in the Dutchess County Historical Society collection. An article in the Pine Plains Register from June 19, 1896, reports on a reception for the local chapter of the DAR hosted by Mrs. Frank Eno, who exhibited, among other, quote, mementos of days long gone by, end quote, a picture embroidered in silk made at the Sketchley School by Elizabeth Smith, Mrs. Eno's grandmother, over 90 years prior. Here is a close-up of the Elizabeth Smith embroidery showing the fine shading, wealth of silk colors, and attention to detail. This example was made by Mary Hoyt from Norwalk, Connecticut, who went on to marry Charles Sherman and become the mother of Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman. It is now housed in the Sherman House Museum in Lancaster, Ohio. Mary attended the Sketchley's boarding school along with the daughters of other prominent and well-to-do families. Mary's schoolgirl needlework was so important to her that she chose it to be amongst the few possessions that she carried by wagon when they made the 2-month trip west to Ohio in 1811. The second of Mary's embroideries is this mourning piece dedicated to her 2 deceased sisters, also likely made at the Sketchley School, and done in a technique often referred to as print work. This style of needlework uses extremely fine black silk stitched on silk satin and using stitches that imitate engraving. This is the same style of embroidery that we saw in Esther Bevere's Warwick Castle piece earlier. One thing that cannot be denied is that the Sketchley sisters must have been skilled embroidery designers and teachers, and that their reputation as such brought them pupils of means. The supplies needed to complete these fine pieces and the reverse glass painted mats and elaborate frames that some of these pieces retain would have been extremely expensive. Several of the beautiful and finely stitched pieces from the Sketchley Sisters School exist around the country. Another done by Margaret McKay when the Sketchleys relocated their school to then rural Upper Manhattan resides at the Smithsonian. As part of my ongoing research on the Sketchleys, I have located quite a few other pieces and am in pursuit of a few more. Another type of embroidery on silk is the map sampler. More common in Great Britain than in the United States, these pieces usually combine ink drawing and watercolor with intricate and fine stitching. Arguably, the most detailed and beautiful map samplers made in this country were done at the Pleasant Valley Boarding School right here in Dutchess County. Operating from 1803 to about 1824, it was a school run by Quakers, with several of its teachers having been educated at the Nine-Partner School, which we will discuss next. And just as we see with the Sketchley pieces, Pleasant Valley map samplers are now located across the country. Anne Friedland, the author of a wonderful article on these samplers that appeared in the 1997-98 Dutchess County Historical Society yearbook, was surprised to find one in a Florida museum. Here we see Polly Platt's hemisphere map from the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Miriam Franklin's North and South America map from Whittaker. Here are some close-ups of the Polly Platt map showing some of the fine embroidery. The next 2 map samplers are from the Dutchess County Historical Society, and they are Ann Townsend's Hemisphere map and Ann Beadle's North America. And here's a close-up of Ann Townsend's embroidery, showing the remarkably small scale and attention to detail. Holly Platt and Ann Beadle were both 14 when they made their maps, and of the more than 30 Pleasant Valley map samplers that have been located, the embroiderers who have been identified ranged in age from 9 to 20, with most falling in about the center of that range. At least one of the girls made more than one map sampler during her attendance. And remarkably, a sampler has just surfaced, which names the Pleasant Valley Boarding School, but is not a map sampler. To my knowledge, this is the first such sampler to be found. More on this in a few minutes. And that brings us to some of the most well-known samplers produced in Dutchess County, those made at the Nine Partners Boarding School. The famous Quaker School, located near where Nine Partners Meeting House still stands, opened in 1796 and operated for more than 60 years, and had among its pupils and teachers many famous men and women, especially those who went on to influence education and social reform. The school moved to Union Springs, New York in 1857, where it became Oakwood Seminary, then to Poughkeepsie in 1920, where it eventually became the Oakwood Friends School in Spackenkill that continues today. The small house pictured on the lower right is that of Deborah and Jacob Willits, among the most famous of the teachers at Nine Partners School. The history of the school is more than I can even touch on in this talk, but I suspect that knowing the connection between Nine Partners and Creek Meeting Quaker congregations, many of you are very familiar with it. The influence of Nine Partners on the tradition of schoolgirl needlework in Dutchess County cannot be overstated. Early students went on to become teachers in both Quaker and non-Quaker schools around the country, and they took the needlework skills they learned at Nine Partners with them. We were fortunate at our Dutchess County Sampler ID Days to have 2 large collections of Nine Partners samplers brought for documentation, as well as several individual examples. Several identifiable types or designs of samplers were made at Nine Partners School, ranging from simple marking or alphabet samplers to more complex styles. Here you see 2 typical Quaker alphabet samplers with the usual Roman lettering done in dark silk. Notice that the Deborah Fox piece on the left includes 2 elements typical of Quaker samplers. The depiction of ligatures, connected letters used in printing, is often found on Quaker pieces, and the arrangement of letters and numbers titled "The Rule to Mark Napkins," which seems to be specific to the school. The origins of the rule have not yet been precisely identified, but the arrangements of letters, which represent family initials, has been seen on brickwork on early Pennsylvania Quaker buildings. Here you see 2 more examples, Rebecca Field and Margaret Marriott, which use the rule, but does not identify it. 2 more extract samplers are shown here, Jemima Jaycax from 1806 and Rebecca Fritz from 1826, showing how long this format persisted at Nine Partners. Next is Millie Holmes' sampler from 1820, which pairs the usual Roman alphabets with some more decorative but still simple, typical Quaker floral motifs. I recently acquired Millie's sampler from the collection of the late Glee Kruger, my friend and mentor, who was a leading authority on American samplers. Although Glee had researched hundreds of samplers in her collection, there was little found about Millie in her archive, so the investigation began. More on this one later as well. This sampler is being reproduced, and the reproduction chart will be offered in the future as a fundraiser for the Dutchess County Sampler Initiative. The next 2 nearly identical samplers are of a more decorative style and employ the partial geometric motifs that are found on English Quaker samplers from the Ackworth School and Pennsylvania Quaker School samplers. Shown here is a watercolor of the school done by Julia Wilbur, whose sampler was on the previous slide. Because a few of these watercolors have been found, it is presumed that they were the result of a class assignment. Julia, who later became a noted abolitionist and suffragist, kept remarkable diaries, and her life is the subject of the book, A Civil Life in an Uncivil Time by Paula Tarnopol Whittaker. And yes, that is our Julia on the cover. Now that you've seen examples of the types of samplers and schoolgirl embroideries, why, you may ask, is it important to document samplers? There are many reasons. Samplers and other schoolgirl embroideries were an essential part of female education in Western Europe, Britain, and the United States from the 17th through the 19th centuries. Appearance and materials changed over time and reflected school and teachers' influences, as well as differing religious, economic, regional, and familial context. Often the choice of design, inclusion of a verse, or the stitchers, teachers, or family names included can lead to important historical discoveries. We can learn about how and where young women were taught, the importance of education or religion to their families, the patterns of migration of individual families and groups, ties of genealogy, and more. And poignantly, we often find that a young girl's sampler is the only physical record of her existence. The research completed by sampler scholars, especially in the past few decades, has brought many of these formerly forgotten young women in their lives the attention they deserve. It is also important to note that textiles are inherently fragile and especially subject to light damage. Professional conservation is costly and may be out of reach for the individual owner or even a public entity. Any sampler owner, be it an individual, a local historical society, or a larger institution, must always strike a balance between exhibiting the object and storing it away for protection. Documenting and including samplers in the sampler archive will mean that the images will be preserved and the pieces will be able to be viewed and studied safely. The following slides, which I will go through quickly, will give you an idea of how the Sampler Archive website works. It is open to anyone and can be reached at samplerarchive.org. The opening page has a changing banner that lists some of the collections that have already been included. At present, there are more than 5,000 samplers and related schoolgirl needlework publicly accessible or in the documentation pipeline. That number is growing every day. The archive can be browsed with the buttons at left. The contributor button, for example, allows you to search for samplers from a single contributor, in this case, the DAR in Washington, D.C., which was one of our 3 pilot sites and helped us to establish and standardize the documentation protocol. You can also search by type of sampler, in this case, family record samplers. Note that the search results have objects from multiple contributors, in this case, the DAR and also Rhode Island Historical Society. This is an example of search results from memorials and mourning embroideries. Note results again have objects from multiple contributors, DAR and Whittaker. From the search results, you can click on any image or title to see more information. That will bring you to the object detail page. The object detail page includes a large, high-resolution image of the sampler, which can be zoomed to very fine detail, and basic information to the right. Below the image are 4 documentation records: physical characteristics, maker history, object history, and related objects. Here you will see, if known, the maker's name, birthplace, age, place the sampler was made, year made, decade made, contributor, and other information about the sampler's current location. For example, if it is in a museum, it will specify the accession number and donor. This is a sampler from Vermont, stitched by a girl born in Rhode Island, owned by a museum in New York. And here you see how far you can zoom the images to see actual stitches and threads. Physical characteristics list such things as dimensions, materials, stitches and motifs used, transcription of any text, etc. Maker history describes all that is known about the stitcher, herself, and her family. There is also another tab for object history, which gives as much as is known about the provenance of the sampler and lists, if applicable, any exhibitions or publications in which it has been included. The Related Objects tab has not yet been activated, but at some point, this will be the place to find out if any other items related to the sampler maker have been identified. Although our Sampler Initiative documents all American samplers which now reside in the county, regardless of origin, we expected that many previously unknown Dutchess County pieces would come to light, and that has certainly been the case. This is an exciting prospect and one which leads to yet another facet of this project. The archive projects which have been completed, such as in Delaware and Rhode Island, have already led to exhibits and publications, examples of which are shown here. A long-term goal of the Dutchess County Initiative would be to do the same. In preparation for that, our team is also gathering information on known Dutchess County samplers held elsewhere. Our database of hundreds of confirmed locally made pieces continues to grow. Our hope is that, as well as someday publishing a definitive book on Dutchess County samplers, we will also be able to organize exhibits, publish new research, and encourage local historical societies and sites to develop programming that features schoolgirl needlework and female education. And now a word about the Sampler Consortium, sponsoring organization for the Sampler Archive. The Sampler Consortium is an international membership organization dedicated to the study of historic samplers and related girlhood embroideries, founded in June 2008. Membership in the Sampler Consortium is free, and there are now more than 1,200 members representing 18 countries in all 50 states. Members include scholars from diverse disciplines, curators of museums and historical societies, genealogists, librarians, collectors, dealers, publishers, needlework teachers, designers, and stitchers. Also represented are more than 35 museums or historical societies with collections of early girlhood needlework and more than 180 private collectors. The Sampler Consortium has three major objectives: to advance the study of historic samplers and other girlhood embroideries, to increase access to information and research relevant to these studies, and to design, develop, and support projects that advance those studies. I would encourage anyone with an interest in samplers to join. It is a wonderful resource for information about all things sampler related, including events, exhibits, publications, and forum articles by experts in the field. Membership is free, and you can sign up at samplerconsortium.org. And now we get to the fun stuff. Now on to some sampler stories, as I like to call them. Each of the samplers in these stories have ties to Clinton or the nearby area. The first piece I would like to show was made by Joanna B. Smith. Joanna dated her piece October 14th, 1830, and added Poughkeepsie, likely the site of the school she attended. I purchased this sampler in 2008 from an eBay seller in Santa Fe, New Mexico. At the time, I was excited to see the Poughkeepsie attribution on the sampler, as not many local pieces had surfaced. The seller had done some preliminary genealogical research, some of which proved to be correct and some not. In the next few years, I searched on and off for Joanna. Records were just beginning to be digitized, and often going back to the same searches after a few years yielded new results. And I've certainly found that out over the past few weeks. Even as late as 2 weeks ago, when I went back to confirm details for this talk, I found that much more relevant information was now available. Joanna Burhan Smith was born to Uriah Platt Smith and his second wife, Eleanor, known as Nellie Burhan Flagler. Uriah, born in 1711, was the son of Jacob Smith and Rebecca Hewlett Peters. By now, you will probably already recognize some familiar local surnames in this family tree. In fact, a look at the book, A Peters Lineage, compiled by Martha Bouquet Flint, shows that the Peters, Smith, and Burhan's families intermarried for generations. This makes research on a sampler like Joanna's challenging, to say the least. And the common practice of using surnames and mother's maiden names as first and middle names of children makes things even more confusing. Uriah's first wife, Molly Lester, with whom he shared at least 8 and likely more children, died in 1813 at age 42, and he married Joanna's mother, Nellie, in 1815. Nellie was a widow, having been previously married to Simon Flagler of Pleasant Valley, who died in 1813. At that time, Uriah was 43 and his new bride was 37. They began a second family when son David Burhan Smith was born in 1816, but sadly he died at less than 2 months old. Joanna was born next on the 21st of February, 1817, but the family happiness was short-lived as her father Uriah died on the 1st of April, little more than a month after her birth. What the first 6 years of Joanna's life was like, we cannot be sure. She and her mother may have remained at the Smith homestead after Uriah's death. The location of that homestead brings us to another one of the sampler research coincidences that I like to think are in some way directed by the spirits of the young needleworkers. As I said earlier, I'd been looking into Joanna's story on and off for years. I'd run across a few lines in the aforementioned Peter's genealogy about her grandmother Rebecca's burial in, quote, the family burial ground under the locus of the old homestead. It's what it says here under this yellow. J.W. Patcher's 1920 survey, Old Gravestones of Dutchess County, New York, listed the Smith ground, known as Under the Locust, as a mile south of Salt Point on the Pleasant Valley Road east of the creek on the west side of the road. This put the location near the camp on Scout Road. Continuing to trace Joanna's genealogy, I was amazed to find a detailed and rather flowery description of the homestead in, of all places, History of Jefferson County, Pennsylvania by K.M. Scott, published in 1888. The book contained a wealth of information about the family, some of whom had emigrated to Pennsylvania, but I would like to read you just a bit. And I quote from that book. The old manse of the Smiths, built long before the Revolution, is yet standing, remember this is 1888, a few miles east of Poughkeepsie, New York, and was, down to 1872, occupied by the successive generations of the family. In provincial days, it was regarded as an architectural achievement of considerable merit. It is a two-story structure with a roof of steep incline, under whose eaves small slide windows afforded loopholes through which the aggressive Indians were kept at bay. Wooden hooks for gun rests depended from the rafters, and the house was at once a residence and fortress. The kitchen is the one grand room. The windows are small with massive frames, and the doors are of hard wood and very thick, opening in horizontal sections and locked with great iron bars. Every feature is impressive of strength and defense, and suggestive of the perils that environed the colonial inhabitants. The broad, deep fireplace is formed of huge boulders and is of itself a primeval poem. The family burying ground is adjacent, and the numerous gray stone slabs tell their sepulchral story. Here, with the generations of the Smiths, mingle the bones of those whose loves and lives were mingled in the flesh. There are Eli's, Lester's, Peter's, Bloom's, and a relic of early slavery, one old Negro named Deb, for Jacob Smith, the grandfather of Valentine H.P. Smith, was an extensive slave owner, and when their freedom was obtained, they were granted a living on the homestead as long as they desired to remain. Everything here shows decadence, save perhaps the prestige of honor marked upon the tombstones. Even the very wall, built high and strong as the everlasting adamant, totters and disintegrates. And when the stony epitaphs, telling of one being a power in the land and another judge of the king's bench, etc., crumble into dust, tradition itself will fade and pass away, and time will bury beneath her rubbish the very memory of things that were once majestic and mighty. We'll see about that. Finally, in 2016, I was able to pinpoint the location and visit the site. At first, there was no sign of any cemetery, but after digging around in the leaves, several stones were uncovered, including Uriah Platt Smith's, which is embedded in a tree trunk. It was really heartbreaking to see the state of this ground, and if anyone knows how to go about a restoration effort, please let me know. Sadly, the house was long gone, and a modern dwelling sat on the site next to the unmarked burial ground. And here, I thought this part of the story reached a conclusion. Then one day, while scrolling through a Facebook page about Pleasant Valley history, up popped this photo by Fred Schaefer of an old house, which, although it had been the victim of Victorian era adulteration, still belied its earlier construction. The posting mentioned that the old abandoned house had burned in the 1970s. Through that post, I was able to contact a woman whose husband was a member of the Smith family. He was 3 times great-grandson of Joanna's half-brother Benjamin. She was able to confirm that this was indeed the former home of the Uriah Platt Smith family. Since there are burials there from well into the mid-1800s, it is likely that some family remained there after Uriah's death and that Johanna spent her early childhood in that home. Nellie married for the third time in 1823. Joanna's stepfather, Wine's Nanny, was a 57-year-old widower when he married Nellie. Although he owned farm property that he had inherited in New Hackensack, he and Nellie were living on Cannon Street by the late 1830s and probably earlier. It is possible that Joanna attended one of the female academies in the city when she made her sampler, but as yet we do not know. Joanna married Peter Burhans, a successful Poughkeepsie carriage maker, in 1845 when she was 28. Peter was the son of William Burhans and Mary Smith of Pleasant Valley. By now you can see how the family connections can become a muddle. Burhans Smith, Burhans muddle. Although Nellie sold the Cannon Street home to Joanna, she continued living there with the married couple. Joanna and Peter had a son, Albert, who lived only 1 year, followed by 2 daughters, Ella and Mary. Joanna died in 1859 at age 42. 1 year later, Peter married Eliza Pinckney, and Nellie continued to live in the household along with her granddaughters. Peter and Eliza had no children and both lived into the 1880s. The newspaper article from 1913 notes the sale of Peter's former 394 Main Street business property to Joseph Perlmutter. This property was just a few doors from what became the site of Perlmutter's furniture store, a fixture of downtown Poughkeepsie for more than 50 years. To put a close to the research on Joanna, I sought to find her resting place. There seemed to be no record of it. Knowing that Peter Burhans was buried in the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery, I stopped by the office to find his location and was surprised to learn that Joanna was also there. She is buried along with Peter, their son Albert, daughter Mary, daughter Ella, Ella's husband Isaac Germond, and their children. Peter's second wife Eliza is also buried in the same plot. It was a close family. Joanna's last living granddaughter, Grace, died at age 98 in 2008, the same year that Joanna's sampler made its way to me. She had been residing at the Lutheran Care Center at the same time as my mother, but sadly I had not found all this information. I wish I could have had the opportunity to talk with her, show her the sampler, and learn more about Joanna's life. And now I'm going to detour back for a moment. This is how sampler research happens. It is never a straight trajectory, but the circuitous route is where the magic happens. Typing out this talk, the name Isaac Germond rang a bell. I remembered Catherine Hamilton Smith, who had recently contacted me about the Pleasant Valley boarding school sampler, which we saw earlier. That was such an exciting discovery, but one that I had not had time yet to pursue. Wasn't the stitcher's name Germond? We had chatted about that family name in the Germond Family Murders book, and hadn't she provided a family tree? A sort through the emails revealed that her stitcher, Sally Germond, 1790 to 1855, was the daughter of an Isaac Germond. That Isaac was the grandfather of Joanna's daughter, Ella's husband. In other words, her sampler maker's nephew married my sampler maker's daughter. That may seem like a weak connection, but in terms of schoolgirl embroidery, it can be important. Joanna may have been born 27 years after Sally, but they are still linked. Tracing the family members they share has already led to the name stitch on several samplers known to us. It was quite a coincidence that a woman from Nebraska just happened to contact me while I was researching a related local sampler that I had found in New Mexico. The next story is a shorter one. This sampler was made by Mellie Holmes at the Nine Partners School in 1830. As stated before, I acquired it from the late Lee Kruger's collection and was delighted both to have something to remind me of a good friend and mentor and to bring the sampler home in a sense. The sampler itself is simple but pretty, and part of its charm in a way is the way Mellie found to squeeze in the last letters of the alphabet when she had run out of room in a line. Finding out something about Mellie is proving to be a challenge, and there's more to learn, but there may be a Nine Partners connection apart from her attendance at the boarding school. It is possible that she is the Millie H. Mabbitt, wife of Joseph S. Mabbitt. This may have been the Joseph who inherited property from his father and donated that property for the building of the Nine Partners School in 1795, before he moved upstate with his family. Researching Mellie has been difficult, in part due to the Dutchess County Quakers' penchant for moving from one community to another. Saratoga, Skaneateles, and Vermont were all places that Holmes Quaker families emigrated, many moving back and forth between these places and others throughout their lives. Another problem has been her rather odd first name. The name Melly occurs several times in the Holmes family and does not appear to have been a diminutive for another name, but census enumerators seem to have struggled with it. It appears in several forms such as Millie and Molly. The research on this one continues. Now we come to the star of our show. You may not think this unassuming sampler has star quality, but I hope after you hear the story, you will change your mind. We'll see in a minute, but first let's start at the beginning with this sampler from the Clinton Historical Society collection. When planning our first Sampler ID Day, I contacted Craig Marshall to see if CHS had any samplers to document. He mentioned that they had a very special sampler made by Abigail Halstead that was marked Clinton and was, as he put it, inked. He sent me an image and it appeared to be a typical Quaker extract or verse sampler, and I was puzzled and somewhat skeptical of the description. So many Quaker samplers of this period, such as the Eliza Doty sampler shown earlier and on display here tonight, are stitched on a remarkably fine fabric with tiny stitches that could easily be mistaken for writing in ink. And just as we saw in Mary Hoyt's printwork picture, some embroidery was intended to replicate ink on paper. But when Craig invited me to see the piece, I was fascinated to see that it was indeed done in ink on very fine silk gauze. The letter style was identical to that used on many Quaker samplers, and each ink square duplicated what would be one cross stitch on an embroidery. In other words, Abigail produced her piece by marking each stitch in ink, just as if she was embroidering, using each intersection of the threads in the silk ground fabric to replicate her stitches. Unfortunately, owing to the delicate condition of this piece, in which it must spend most of its time in archival storage, but Craig and Cynthia agreed to have it documented at the first Sampler ID Day. We all felt that this was important because it is such a rare sampler, and we are considering it a sampler even though it is not embroidered. After seeing Abigail's work, I contacted several well-known and respected experts, and none of them had ever seen another work like it. It was an intriguing mystery, and there were many questions to be answered. Where was it made? What school might Abigail have attended? Was this a type of work taught by a specific teacher, or did it serve as a pattern? What was Abigail's story? As much as I wanted to find some answers, the Sampler Initiative took up much of my time, and the Abigail Halstead sampler images went into the ever-growing to-do file. Then, just as these sampler coincidences often seem to occur, a friend in the sampler world, who is part of our effort to find Dutchess County embroideries, alerted me to a piece coming up for auction. She mentioned that the auction house listed it as inked, although she thought that was an error. One glance told the story. There was no mistake. This is what was pictured, the Hannah Ann Doty sampler, nearly a duplicate of Abigail Halstead's work. Luckily, no one else appreciated the importance of this rather drab piece, and I was able to purchase it for a very reasonable price from an auction house in Hudson. I immediately began the search for Hannah Ann, and she proved easier to find than most sampler makers. She was born in Clinton on March 20th, 1813, the daughter of David Doty and Elizabeth Sands Doty. Her older brother, Thomas Sands Doty, had been born in 1810, and Hannah's birth was followed by her two sisters, Mary in 1819 and Esther in 1823. Sadly, Hannah's mother, Elizabeth, died at age 41 in 1826 when Hannah was 13, and just 14 months later, her father, David, also died. I wish this yellow wasn't here. At that time, David's will specified that the three girls were to be placed in the care of their 18-year-old brother, Thomas. And interestingly, David specified that farm profits were to be set aside for the comfortable maintenance and education of his daughters. Apparently, education was important to the family, as Thomas was active in the building of a later schoolhouse, and at one point, a local school teacher boarded at his home. Where Hannah and her sisters were sent to school, we do not yet know. But it is possible that it was either Nine Partners or another so far unidentified nearby Quaker school. Thomas married Maria Wing in 1832 and went on to have at least 12 children. It seems that Hannah lived her entire life within an area of just a few square miles. Much of the extended Doty family lived on farms around what is now the intersection of Hollow Road and Salt Point Road. And just days before this program, I found this 1951 article that described Thomas Sands Doty living at what became Terrashane Farm, just across the Taconic Parkway at the intersection of Hollow and Clinton Corners roads. Because some historic records list D. Doty as a former owner, it is very likely that this property was Hannah's home, which passed to her brother when her father died, and that she lived there when her sampler was made. This was all the more amazing to me as this is a house I'm familiar with, and I was in the ancient stone basement there just last year. Did I trace Hannah's steps? Yet another coincidence. And just yesterday, I learned from the owner that the original house where Hannah would have lived is not the large stately home pictured, but instead a smaller structure on the property. Thomas Sands Doty used some parts of that original home when he built a larger four-square style house in 1840, and that after many additions and amendments became what we see today. In 1833, at age 18, just a year after her brother married Maria Wing, Hannah married Maria's brother Alexander Wing and moved to the Wing family farm that still stands on the short section of Hollow Road between Salt Point and Taconic Parkway. That farm has been in the Weiland family for many years. Local history writer Anthony Musso published an informative article about the landmark property, one of the oldest in Clinton, in the September 20th, 2020 edition of the Poughkeepsie Journal. Although the closing of the parkway access has now distanced the route between these two properties, following the Hollow Road path that Hannah would have taken, they are about a third of a mile apart. Somewhat surprisingly, it seems like Hannah did not give birth to her first child, a daughter Mary, until 1840, 6.5 years after her marriage. It is, of course, possible that she had other unsuccessful pregnancies or unrecorded children who died in infancy before Mary's birth. Daughter Elizabeth came next in 1842, followed by her only son and last child, George, in 1849. Mary died at age 62, and Alexander survived her by 7 years, dying in 1882 at age 72. They are both buried in the Salt Point Cemetery, along with their son George, his wife, daughter Mary, her husband, and her husband. The Wing family monument is one of the largest and most striking in that place, but I was disappointed to see that the beautiful granite acorn that graced the top of the stone has fallen and sits on the ground. If I was to win the lottery tomorrow, I think one of my first purchases would be the repair and replacement of the acorn on that monument. There are 2 footstones, one marked father and another that is tipped over, presumably marked mother, and marking Hannah Ann's grave. Only one side of the large monument is engraved, the side that lists Hannah and Alexander, and I can't help wondering if they intended for all their children and possible grandchildren to one day rest there. Son George and his wife Alvaretta have separate stones, but their names were never added to the monument. Hannah's daughter Elizabeth married William Marshall, and they are also buried in the family plot, but not listed on the monument. Oldest daughter Mary married Daniel Stringham Baywright, and they rest at the Poughkeepsie Rural Cemetery. And just as Hannah had, her children remain close to home. There are many more interesting stories about Hannah's relatives than we have time to discuss, but here is just one. Hannah's nephew, Agrippa Martin Doty, son of her brother Thomas, was the founder of well-known Doty and Humphrey drugstore in Poughkeepsie. That store was located on Main Street in Poughkeepsie, and the business had moved from one storefront to another as it expanded. Shown here is a bottle of oil of cloves that resided in my grandparents' medicine cabinet, still in use for the occasional toothache. Note the drugstore address on this bottle from after the move in 1925, 394 Main Street. This is the same building that formerly housed the carriage business of Joanna B. Smith's husband, Peter Burhans. Hannah Ann Doty's life centered around a very small area within a few miles of where we sit tonight. Her grandfather and other members rest right outside this building. She was a direct descendant of Edward Doty, who arrived on the Mayflower, Her grandmother was born in the Newburgh house that served as Washington's headquarters during the Revolution, and her family names are still prevalent throughout our area today. And even though her physical sphere was small, the impact of her large extended family on Dutchess County history was great indeed. As of yet, we have not discovered where and under whose direction the two girls, Abigail and Hannah Ann, made their ink samplers, and we have not found any others like them, but the search is continuing. I hope to one day be able to solve the mystery and share those findings with Clinton Historical. If you would like to learn more about samplers or support the documentation effort, there are several ways in which you can participate in the Dutchess County Sampler Initiative. The most important way to participate is to arrange to have any samplers in your collections documented. And of course, it is vital that we get the word out about upcoming ID days, so please share the publicity information. Also, if you know of any sampler owners or collectors, please notify them and let us know so we can contact them. We do not have a date or venue yet for the next event, but we expect it to be in the spring of next year. We would encourage anyone who would like to volunteer at ID days or in another capacity to contact us. We will need documenters and training will be provided. Also needed will be support staff to help with registration and other chores. If genealogy is your interest, we will need help with family history research. There is a sign-up sheet here today for our mailing list for anyone who'd like to keep up on the project. And of course, we do need financial assistance. Although putting this initiative together and documenting all the samplers is done by volunteers, there are expenses involved such as photography and image management, so funds are needed. Any donation you could make or any funding sources you may be able to identify for us would be greatly appreciated. Please consider helping or donating and joining us in preserving the legacy of women in early America. Before I end this presentation, I would like to say that nearly every sampler I've studied in depth has led me down a rabbit hole of research and into a myriad of topics spanning education, history, medicine, religion, genealogy, literature, politics, and even murder mysteries. And many times there have been spooky coincidences involved in the uncovering of all this information. I leave it up to you to decide whether these things are indeed coincidences or if the desire of these girls to be remembered somehow directed my path. I'd be happy to answer your questions, and I would encourage you to look at the samplers and other items on display. Thank you.
Do you know, were the students working off of like models?
That is a fantastic question. That is a question that, that is asked over and over again. There is really almost no primary source evidence of what they used for models. So many of the pieces, like the Hannah Jane that you saw, and the one that was just like it, are nearly stitch by stitch identical. So it begs the question, did they have some sort of pattern? If they did, none of them have survived. Some pieces, especially the silk embroideries, were there. Someone actually drew what they embroidered, oftentimes a teacher, and sometimes even following the English model, pieces of silk were given to a professional to draw the lines that they would embroider on. But as far as the counted stitch pieces, we really don't have the answer. Did they look at a teacher's model and copy her stitch for stitch? Did they, did she have some sort of paper pattern? We don't know the answer. One thing that has surfaced recently that's really kind of interesting is a 9 partners piece that has the rule to mark napkins on it, doesn't have a name, but the initials in the rule line up with the initials of one of the very famous teachers at 9 partners. So we're wondering if that was a model. We don't have the answer to that one. I wish I knew. Anybody else? I have questions up there. Okay. Okay. I don't know how to get to them. Oh, could I share the archive address? Yes, it is samplerarchive.org. Sampler Consortium also has conservators as members. Yes, it does. And there is an address for finding conservators. Thank you. Okay. And Ray Niles is a conservator. I don't see any questions. Oh, it goes more, okay. Yeah, my screen doesn't move down. Kathy, do you know if there are questions? Kathy's gone. Okay.
No, I'm here. I don't see any
Oh.
questions in the chat.
Okay.
If anybody would like to unmute and ask a question, you're welcome to. Nobody.
Okay. Thank you so much. And please go and look at the things, and if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to answer them.